The hardest part about being betrayed by your own family isn't the anger. It's the silence. It's the way the air feels when you realize the people who should love you most are actually rooting for your downfall. I sat at the petitioner's table in a cold, wood-paneled courtroom, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a siren outside. My younger brother, Ryan, was sitting just a few feet away. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a success story. He wore a tailored navy suit and a watch that cost more than my first car. He was the golden boy, the one our parents, Linda and Thomas, had spent their lives protecting. As the bailiff cleared his throat, Ryan leaned toward me. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He just gave me this small, chilling smile and whispered low enough that only I could hear. "Finally, Evelyn," he said. "Finally, your house is mine." I looked at my lap, focusing on the grain of the table. Behind him, I could see my parents. My mother was staring at her hands, avoiding my gaze like I was a ghost she didn't want to see. My father sat tall, his eyes fixed on the back of Ryan's head with a look of pure pride. It was a look he hadn't given me in years. To them, I was just the daughter who stayed behind, the one who did the hard work while Ryan went off to chase a lifestyle he couldn't afford. This house wasn't just a building to me. It was the colonial on the corner with the creaky third step and the overgrown garden I had spent every weekend weeding. It was where we grew up, but more importantly, it was where I had spent the last 5 years taking care of everything while they lived their lives. It was my home, my stability, and my legacy. To Ryan, it was just an asset to be flipped. I know many of you watching have probably dealt with a sibling who thinks they're entitled to everything you've worked for. I'd love to hear where you're watching from. It helps to know I'm not the only one who has had to stand their ground against family. This whole nightmare didn't start with a big blow-up or a screaming match in the driveway. It started with one casual comment at a family dinner. Ryan had looked at my dad and said that since I was unmarried and alone, it didn't make sense for me to stay in such a big house. He framed it as being helpful. He told them he could manage the property better. He didn't ask me. He talked over me as if I were a piece of furniture. That was the moment I realized my family didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an obstacle. Now, sitting in front of Judge Holloway, the reality was sinking in. Ryan had spent months whispering in our parents' ears, convincing them that I was the one being difficult, that I was the one trying to steal from him. He had played the victim so well that they actually believed I was the villain. Ryan was so confident today because he thought he had already won. He had the parents on his side, he had a high-priced lawyer, and he had a sense of entitlement that could fill the entire room. He thought this court date was just a formality before he could kick me out and put up a for sale sign. He looked at me as if I were already gone. But as the judge opened the first file, I felt a strange sense of calm. Ryan thinks this is about who owns the deed. He thinks this is about property lines and market value. He thinks this is about ownership. It isn't. It's about the truth they've been trying to bury, and I'm the only one with the shovel. The house was a classic 1980s colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburb where the lawns were manicured with the precision of a golf course. Growing up, the mailbox with our name, the Carters, was more than just a place for bills, it was a landmark. It was the kind of neighborhood where the HOA would send you a polite but firm letter if your trash cans were visible from the street for more than 24 hours after pickup. For me, that house was an anchor. I remember the smell of the wraparound porch after a heavy summer rain, the way the wood held onto the heat of the day, and the sound of the cicadas in the old oak trees. On the 4th of July, our driveway was the hub of the block. My father would spend all morning at the grill, the scent of charcoal and marinated steak tips wafting through the screen door, while my mother prepared huge bowls of potato salad and her famous slow-baked mac and cheese with the crispy breadcrumb topping. It was the American dream in brick and mortar, a place where we were supposed to be safe. But even back then, there was an imbalance in the way the house felt for me versus how it felt for Ryan. I was the one who helped my mother scrub the baseboards and polish the silver for Thanksgiving. I knew exactly which floorboards in the hallway creaked, and I knew how to jiggle the handle on the guest bathroom door to make it lock properly. Ryan, on the other hand, treated the house like a high-end hotel. He was 4 years younger, the miracle baby born after my parents had given up on having a second child. While I was tasked with raking the endless piles of oak leaves in October, Ryan was encouraged to focus on his sports or his projects. I remember one afternoon specifically. I was sweat-streaked and covered in dirt, hauling heavy bags to the curb, while Ryan sat on the porch steps drinking a cold soda, watching me. He didn't offer to help. Instead, he looked at the house, then back at me, and said, "Dad says this place is going to be worth $1 million someday. I'm going to put a pool exactly where those rose bushes are." He was 12 years old, and he was already measuring the yard for his own future. My parents didn't correct him. They laughed, calling him ambitious. They didn't see the entitlement taking root. To them, his interest in the property value was a sign of intelligence, while my quiet maintenance of the home was just expected of me. Over the years, I became the custodian of the family's history. I was the one who stayed behind during my 20s to help when my father had his first heart scare. I was the one who updated the kitchen cabinets with my own savings and spent my weekends painting the shutters a deep, classic navy. I wasn't doing it for an investment. I was doing it because the house was a member of the family. I thought my parents saw that. I thought they understood that while Ryan was out in the city living a life of expensive dinners and leased European cars, I was the one keeping the roof from leaking. But the house meant something very different to Ryan. He didn't see the memories of the Sunday roasts or the height marks penciled into the kitchen pantry door. He didn't care about the history of the neighborhood or the neighbors who had known us since we were in diapers. To him, the house was a safety net for his mounting debts, a bank account with a chimney. He saw a pile of equity that he felt he was entitled to simply because he was the son who had big plans. I looked at the house and saw a legacy that needed to be protected at all costs. Ryan looked at the house and saw a payout that he was ready to take, even if it meant leaving me with nothing but the dust. The shift didn't happen with a shouting match or a slammed door. It happened over a quiet Sunday dinner, the kind we had shared hundreds of times before. I had spent the afternoon roasting a prime rib, the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had spent my own money to install the quartz countertops and the farmhouse sink. Ryan was sitting in my father's recliner, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon he'd found in the back of the liquor cabinet. He looked at the ceiling, then at my mother, and let out a long, theatrical sigh. "You know, Mom," he started, his voice soft and laced with a fake kind of concern, "this house is just getting so big. It's a lot of maintenance for Evelyn to handle all by herself. It's almost irresponsible of us to let her carry this burden when she should be out living her life, finding someone, starting her own path." I was standing at the stove, my back to him, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the draft from the window. He wasn't attacking me. He was framing my life as a tragedy that needed his intervention. My father nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with the beginnings of age and a lifelong habit of believing whatever Ryan said. "Ryan's right, Eve," my father said, looking at me. "You've been a saint staying here, but maybe it's time we think about the logistics. A house like this is an asset, and assets need to be managed properly. Ryan has been looking at the market trends. He thinks we're at the peak. He says if we don't move now, we're essentially throwing money away." I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I didn't say a word. I watched Ryan's face. There was no warmth there. There was no actual concern for my burden. He was looking at the walls the way a surveyor looks at a plot of land. It was in that moment I realized this wasn't an emotional family discussion. It was a calculated business move. Ryan didn't care that I had paid the property taxes for the last 3 years while he was between jobs. He didn't care that I had replaced the water heater or that I was the one who knew the exact frequency of the lawn service. To him, my presence in the house was a liability. Every month I lived there was a month he couldn't get his hands on his share of the equity. He began making these little comments every time we were together. He'd mention how the vibe of the neighborhood was changing, or how the roof looked like it might need $20,000 in repairs that I clearly couldn't afford. He was planting seeds of doubt in our parents' minds, making them believe that I was a ticking financial time bomb. He was making them feel like they were doing me a favor by considering selling the house out from under me. The stinging part wasn't the greed, it was the logic. He used the language of American pragmatism, efficiency, investment, market value, to mask the fact that he was trying to evict his own sister. He never once asked me what I wanted. He talked about me in the third person while I was standing right in front of him. I saw my mother's resolve weakening as she looked at Ryan with that desperate need to please her son. I realized then that if I fought him with words, I would lose. If I got angry, I'd be the unstable one he claimed I was. If I cried, I'd be too emotional to handle the property. I stayed silent, watching him pour himself another drink, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. I understood now that my silence wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a tactical choice. Let him talk. Let him build his case on sand. I realized that my silence protected me more than any argument ever could, because the less he knew about what I was thinking, the less he could prepare for the day I finally stopped being quiet. The air in the attorney's conference room was thick with the scent of expensive leather and old paper. Ryan's lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, sat across from me with a posture so stiff it looked painful. He was exactly what you'd expect for the price Ryan was likely putting on a credit card: sharp, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of empathy. He didn't look at me like I was a person. He looked at me like a line item that needed to be balanced. Ryan sat next to him, tapping a silver pen against the mahogany table, a rhythmic, annoying sound that filled the gaps between Thorne's legal jargon. They had brought my parents along, too. Linda and Thomas sat at the far end of the table, looking like they were attending a funeral for a daughter who was still very much alive. Thorne cleared his throat and slid a thick stack of documents toward me, the staple in the corner gleaming under the recessed lighting. Thorne began to speak in that polished, rhythmic tone lawyers use when they want to make common sense sound like a crime. He used words like partition, forced sale, and fiduciary duty as if he were trying to build a wall of sound between me and my home. He explained that because the deed was still technically in my parents' names, despite the years of verbal promises and my financial contributions, Ryan had convinced them to transfer a significant percentage of the interest to him as an early inheritance. This was the public pressure he had been building toward. He wasn't just asking me to leave, he was using the law to claim I had no right to be there in the first place. Ryan leaned back, his eyes dancing with a cruel sort of excitement. He was enjoying the imbalance. He loved that he had a man in a $3,000 suit saying the things he was too cowardly to say to my face. I didn't react. I didn't let my breath hitch, and I didn't let my hands shake. I watched Thorne's mouth move, observing the way Ryan's confidence swelled with every technical term thrown my way. They expected me to break. They expected me to beg my parents to reconsider or to scream about how unfair this was. In the United States, we have this idea that the law is a grand scale of justice, but in rooms like this, it often feels more like a blunt instrument used by whoever can afford the heaviest handle. Ryan was practically vibrating with the thrill of it. He started talking about how he had already contacted a realtor to do a walkthrough, how the suburban market was white-hot, and how a quick close would be best for everyone's mental health. He was already spending the money in his head, probably thinking about a new condo in the city or clearing the debts I knew were piling up behind his flashy lifestyle. As Thorne flipped to the final page of the proposal, a document that essentially gave me 30 days to vacate before they filed a formal partition suit, I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't looking at the highlighted sections or the bolded threats. My eyes drifted to a small, unremarkable clause in the original deed transfer from my grandmother to my parents, a document they had included as an exhibit to prove their chain of title. It was a tiny detail, a specific condition tied to the life estate and the right of first refusal that had been written in a shaky hand decades ago. Thorne hadn't mentioned it. Ryan certainly hadn't noticed it. They were so focused on the power of the present that they had completely overlooked the restrictions of the past. I looked up from the paper and caught Ryan's eye. He smirked, thinking my silence was a sign of defeat. I realized then that their arrogance was their greatest weakness. Something in that legal detail didn't sit right with their narrative, and for the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me stop shaking. The kitchen of my childhood home, a place that used to smell like Sunday pot roast and cinnamon rolls, had turned into a cold interrogation room. My mother, Linda, stood by the window, obsessively polishing a spot on the counter that was already clean. My father, Thomas, sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest like a judge who had already reached a verdict. Ryan stood behind them, his hand resting on my father's shoulder in a show of solidarity that felt more like a performance for an audience of one. I stood in the doorway, the daughter who had spent her weekends painting these walls and her savings fixing the HVAC system, and I realized I was a stranger in my own life. They didn't see the woman who had sacrificed her social life to ensure they could age in place. They saw an obstacle to Ryan's fresh start. Evelyn, why must you be so difficult? My mother's voice was thin, trembling with a manufactured disappointment that cut deeper than any insult. Ryan needs this. He has a vision for his future, and you're just holding on to a bunch of old wood and brick. It's selfish, really. The word selfish hung in the air like a physical weight. In the United States, we're taught that family is the ultimate safety net, the one place where you don't have to prove your worth. But as I looked at them, I saw the American obsession with the golden child play out in real time. Ryan had always been the one they pinned their hopes on, the one whose failures were always someone else's fault. If he lost money, it was the economy. If he lost a job, it was a bad boss. And now, if he was broke, it was because his sister was hoarding the family's primary asset. My father cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. We've already made up our minds, Eve. We're signing the house over to Ryan's management trust. He's going to handle the sale, and he's promised to set aside a small portion for your relocation. You should be grateful he's even thinking of you after the way you've behaved. I watched Ryan's face. He didn't look guilty. He looked vindicated. He was using the oldest trick in the book, shame. They weren't using facts, they were using the emotional debt they felt I owed them for being born. They wanted me to feel small, to feel like my years of caretaking were just a standard requirement of my existence, while Ryan's presence was a gift that needed to be rewarded with a six-figure payout. The isolation was total. Friends I had known for years started calling me, their voices awkward, mentioning that they'd heard I was making things hard for my parents in their old age. Ryan had been busy on social media and at the local country club, painting a picture of a bitter, lonely sister who was trying to block her parents from a comfortable retirement. It was a masterclass in reputation destruction. I realized that as long as I sought their approval, I was giving them the power to destroy me. I looked at the three of them, the brother who wanted to sell my soul for a commission and the parents who were handing him the price tag. For the first time, the sting of their rejection didn't make me want to cry. It made me feel nothing. I was detaching, peeling my heart away from the need for their validation. I wasn't their daughter anymore, and they weren't my family. They were just opposing parties in a very expensive game, and I was finally ready to play by the real rules. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying to be loved and start trying to be logical. Once I detached from the need for my parents' approval, the world didn't get darker, it got sharper. While Ryan was busy celebrating his inevitable win, I began a process of quiet, meticulous observation. In the United States, we have a saying that the devil is in the details, but I've found that the truth usually hides in the paperwork that people are too arrogant to read. Ryan had always been a big picture person, which is really just a polite way of saying he was lazy with the fine print. He spent his afternoons on the phone with real estate agents, bragging about the vintage charm and prime suburban location of the house, while I spent my nights in the basement with a scanner and a mountain of old files. I started tracking the timing of everything. I looked at the bank statements from the last 5 years, the years I had been living in the house and paying for its upkeep. I found every receipt for the new roof, the plumbing overhauls, and the electrical upgrades. I documented every cent I had funneled into the property while Ryan was living in a high-rise downtown. But more importantly, I started looking at the paper trail of Ryan's own life. He had become so overconfident that he didn't realize how much he was leaving exposed. He would leave his laptop open on the kitchen island, or leave printed projections of his future earnings sitting in the recycling bin. I watched him like a scientist observing a specimen. I saw the way his hands shook slightly when he checked his email, the way he'd snap at my mother if she asked a question about the management trust he was so proud of. He wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. The intelligence shift in our house was palpable, though I kept it hidden behind a mask of weary resignation. Ryan thought he was playing chess against a broken woman, so he didn't bother to hide his moves. He began talking openly about the renovation budget he was going to skim from the sale price to pay back his investors. He didn't realize that I was listening to every word from the next room, my phone recording the steady rhythm of his admissions. I wasn't looking for revenge yet, I was looking for the structural integrity of his lies. I was looking for the one pillar that, if pulled, would bring the entire ceiling down on his head. I watched him walk through the backyard one evening, pointing out to a friend where he'd put the infinity pool once he cleared the dead weight, meaning me. He looked so sure of himself, so American in his pursuit of more, and more. He believed that the law was just a tool for the bold, and that my parents' signatures were the only keys he needed. But as I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, cross-referencing the life estate clause I'd found earlier with the state-specific property codes, a cold realization settled in. Ryan was building a skyscraper on a swamp. He was operating under a single, massive assumption that he hadn't bothered to verify because he assumed I was too uneducated to check it. He thought he knew who owned the dirt under his feet. He thought he knew exactly what he was selling. I realized in that moment that his entire case rested on one assumption, and it was an assumption that was about to cost him everything. The courtroom was a study in beige and heavy oak, a place where the American legal system transforms human tragedies into procedural checklists. Judge Holloway sat behind a high bench that seemed to catch every bit of light in the room, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. The gallery was nearly full. Ryan had made sure of that. He wanted a crowd to witness his final victory, inviting distant cousins and family friends under the guise of needing support. He sat at the respondents' table, looking less like a litigant and more like a CEO waiting to accept an award. He had that specific American brand of confidence, the kind that believes if you look successful enough, the facts will eventually bend to fit your image. He kept adjusting his tie and nodding to the gallery, making sure everyone saw how comfortable he was in this house of law. His lawyer, Marcus Thorne, began his opening statement with the practiced ease of a storyteller. He spoke about the changing needs of an aging family and the necessity of professional asset management. He painted a picture of my parents as vulnerable seniors being held hostage by a daughter who refused to let go of the past. It was a compelling narrative, built on the idea that I was a squatter in my own history. Thorne used phrases like maximizing the estate's potential and equitable distribution, turning my years of caretaking into a series of unfortunate delays. While he talked, Ryan performed. He would sigh at the right moments, look at me with a pitying shake of his head, and then offer a reassuring pat to my father's hand. He was playing the part of the dutiful son to perfection, and for a moment, I could see the gallery swaying in his direction. I sat perfectly still, my spine pressed against the hard back of the chair. I didn't interrupt. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't even look at the people behind me who were whispering about how sad it was that it had come to this. In a US courtroom, your silence is often interpreted as a lack of defense, and Ryan was clearly banking on that. He wanted me to look defeated. He wanted the record to show a sister who had nothing left to say because she knew she was wrong. My own attorney, a quiet woman named Sarah who specialized in estate litigation, hadn't said much yet. She just kept her eyes on the documents, occasionally circling something with a red pen. We were the boring side of the room, eclipsed by Ryan's polished performance and Thorne's soaring rhetoric. Judge Holloway, however, was a different story. While Thorne was deep into a tangent about the current real estate market in our suburb, I noticed her eyes drift away from him and toward the files on her desk. She wasn't looking at the colorful charts Ryan's team had prepared. She was looking at the original deed, the one with the dusty history and the handwritten notes. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her gaze shifting between the documents and the confident man standing at the podium. Thorne didn't notice. He was too busy finishing his sentence about the unquestionable right of the parents to transfer their interest. But the judge's pen stopped moving. She looked at me, then back at the deed, and then at Ryan, who was currently flashing a smug smile at a reporter in the second row. There was a subtle flicker of curiosity in her eyes, a quiet questioning of the facts that were being served so confidently on a silver platter. The performance was flawless, but the judge was looking for the script. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the building's ventilation. Ryan was in the middle of his testimony, leaning into the microphone with a tone of rehearsed humility that made my skin crawl. He was explaining to Judge Holloway why he had felt it necessary to take over the family finances, citing my supposed inability to handle the complexity of the property. He spoke about the house as if it were a burden I was too weak to carry, rather than a home I had spent my life protecting. As he spoke, my mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, back to the basement and the smell of damp cardboard. I thought about the blue-bound folder I had found at the bottom of my grandmother's old sewing chest, a document that hadn't been seen since 1994. In the United States, we are a nation of contracts and fine print, yet we often rely on the most basic assumptions of ownership. Ryan was basing his entire claim on a 2022 quitclaim deed he'd pressured my parents into signing during a period of family stress. He looked so sure of himself as he described his plans to renovate and liquidate for the family's benefit. But my mind was fixed on the timing of that 1994 document. It was a trust agreement, one that predated the current deed by nearly 3 decades. My grandmother, a woman who had survived the Great Depression and didn't trust a single soul with her legacy, had been much smarter than anyone gave her credit for. She hadn't just left the house to my parents, she had left it to them with a very specific, ironclad condition regarding the remainder man interest. I watched Ryan adjust his cuffs, his eyes darting to our parents in the front row for a nod of approval. He was so caught up in the theater of his own success that he hadn't stopped to wonder why I hadn't fought him harder during the discovery phase of the trial. To him, my lack of aggressive pushback was a sign of surrender. He didn't realize that in legal battles, the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to lose. He was busy talking about the future value and their investor interest, completely unaware that the very foundation of his legal standing was built on a document that might not even be valid. I had spent hours cross-referencing the signatures and the notary stamps, feeling the weight of the truth settle into my hands. The audience in the gallery was leaning in, captivated by the story of a successful son saving his parents from an overbearing daughter. Ryan was winning the room, but he was losing the case. He was so focused on the how much that he had completely forgotten to verify the how. He was testifying under oath about his right to manage the property, his voice steady and confident. He didn't see me catch my lawyer's eye, nor did he see the slight, almost imperceptible nod she gave me. The tension in the room was shifting, not because of what was being said, but because of what was about to be revealed. Ryan had spent months building a cage for me, but he hadn't checked the lock. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, smiling at the view, never once suspecting that the ground beneath him was about to vanish. Ryan never expected scrutiny, he only ever expected applause. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Ryan had just finished a lengthy, polished explanation of how the new deed would allow him to streamline the family's portfolio. He looked back at our parents and gave a small, reassuring wink. He was the hero of his own movie, waiting for the credits to roll. Marcus Thorne began to gather his papers, a satisfied smirk on his face as if he were already mentally billing the final hours of the case. But then, the sound of a heavy pen hitting the wood of the bench echoed through the room. Judge Holloway didn't look at the lawyers. She didn't look at the gallery. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked directly at my brother. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm in the American Midwest. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, her voice low and dangerously calm. Ryan straightened his posture, flashing a smile that was meant to be charming but came off as desperate. "Yes, Your Honor?" he asked, his voice a fraction higher than it had been a minute ago. Judge Holloway picked up a single sheet of paper from the very bottom of the petitioner's evidence folder, the document I had scanned in the middle of the night. "I've been reviewing the original 1994 irrevocable trust established by your grandmother, Beatrice Carter," she began. "It's a very thorough document." She looked over the rim of her glasses. "Can you explain to this court how you were able to execute a quitclaim deed in 2022 when this trust explicitly grants the remainder interest solely to Evelyn Carter, with no provision for parental transfer without her written, notarized consent?" The air seemed to leave Ryan's lungs all at once. The smug, polished mask he had worn for months didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He looked at Thorne, but his lawyer was staring at the paper in the judge's hand with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Ryan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at our father, then at our mother, searching for the support that had always been there. But they looked just as confused as he was. They had signed whatever Ryan told them to sign, never questioning if he actually had the legal authority to take the house. They had believed his logic without ever checking the math. The silence in the room became absolute. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of a man realizing he had walked into a trap of his own making. Ryan cleared his throat, the sound harsh and dry. "Well, I was under the impression that the trust was superseded by the later filings," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. His confidence, that great American engine that had powered this entire betrayal, had stalled. He looked at me for the first time that day, and for a fleeting second, I saw the little boy who used to hide behind my legs when he broke something. But then the greed returned, replaced by a cold, sharp panic. Judge Holloway didn't move. She just waited, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't asking for an impression, she was asking for a fact that didn't exist. Ryan stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking too big for him, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The silence stretched, second after agonizing second, until it became a physical weight pressing down on him. He was at the breaking point, and he knew it. The silence in the courtroom was not a void, it was a pressurized chamber. Ryan's eyes were fixed on the document in Judge Holloway's hand, a single piece of paper that had effectively turned his sophisticated legal strategy into a pile of ash. In the United States, we are raised to believe that the person with the most confidence wins the room, but the law doesn't care about confidence. It cares about the chain of title. Marcus Thorne, Ryan's high-priced attorney, was frantically flipping through his own binders, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He had built his entire case on a lie of omission that Ryan had fed him, and now, in the middle of a recorded session, he was realizing he had been complicit in a fraudulent transfer. Ryan tried to speak again, but his voice broke, a high, thin sound that lacked any of the authority he had wielded earlier that morning. I didn't know about that specific clause, Ryan managed to say, though even his own lawyer didn't look like he believed him. Judge Holloway's expression remained as stone-cold as the marble columns outside. "Ignorance of a recorded trust is not a defense, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice echoing with the weight of institutional authority. "This trust was designed to protect the property from exactly this kind of predatory transfer. Not only is your quitclaim deed invalid, but the attempt to bypass the remainderman's interest suggests a level of bad faith that this court finds deeply troubling." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the table. I didn't smile. I didn't lean over to whisper "I told you so." I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me, and it was far more devastating than any insult I could have hurled at him. Behind me, the shift in the room was physical. I heard my mother, Linda, let out a sharp, jagged gasp. I turned my head just enough to see her looking at Ryan as if she was seeing him for the first time. The son she had defended, the boy she had called ambitious while he tried to steal his sister's home, was now exposed as a common fraud. My father's head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. They had realized, too late, that their favoritism hadn't just hurt me. It had nearly allowed Ryan to wipe out the family's only real legacy for his own debts. They were realizing that they weren't the co-pilots of a new family era, they were the marks in a long con. The shame in the gallery was palpable. The distant cousins and neighbors who had come to watch my eviction were now whispering in hushed, horrified tones about Ryan's management trust. Ryan looked at me then, and the mask finally fell away completely. The sophisticated businessman was gone, replaced by a desperate, angry man who had run out of places to hide. He didn't have a plan B. He had spent his last dollar on the suit and the lawyer, betting everything on the assumption that I would be too intimidated to look into the past. Judge Holloway tapped her gavel once, not a loud bang, but a final, authoritative click that signaled the end of the debate. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that the title remains with the trust for the benefit of Evelyn Carter," she declared. "I am voiding the 2022 transfer and ordering a full accounting of any assets Mr. Ryan Carter has attempted to move." The house wasn't just safe, it was legally fortified. Ryan slumped into his chair, the weight of the court's validation of my rights finally crushing the last of his arrogance. The walk from the courthouse to the parking lot felt longer than the years I had spent defending my right to exist in my own home. The late afternoon sun was hitting the pavement, creating a shimmering heat that blurred the edges of the world. Ryan was several yards ahead of me, his once sharp gait now a jagged, frantic stride toward his car. He didn't look back. There were no final words, no apologies, and no grand cinematic confrontation. The legal system had stripped him of his power, and without the house to use as collateral or a weapon, he simply didn't know how to look me in the eye. My parents stood near the courthouse steps, looking small and fragile in a way I hadn't noticed before. They stayed in their own bubble of silence, the weight of their misplaced loyalty finally settling into their bones. They had gambled their relationship with their daughter on their son's lies, and they had lost everything. I drove back to the Colonial on the corner, the house that had been the center of this war. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline or a surge of triumphant joy. I felt a profound sense of peace. The mailbox still said the Carters, but the name felt different now. It was no longer a symbol of a unified family. It was a testament to the truth. I walked onto the wraparound porch and sat on the steps, listening to the neighborhood sounds, a lawnmower in the distance, a dog barking, the wind in the oak trees. The house was mine, not because I had won a fight, but because I had refused to abandon the foundation that my grandmother had built. I had stayed silent when they expected me to scream, and I had looked at the fine print when they were blinded by the big picture. In the United States, we are often told that family is a bond that can survive anything, but this experience taught me a harder truth. Blood is just biology. Respect is a choice. Ryan had made his choice long before we stepped into that courtroom, and my parents had made theirs every time they looked the other way. I realized that power isn't about who has the loudest voice or the most expensive lawyer. Power is the ability to sit comfortably in the truth when everyone around you is trying to rewrite it. I didn't need a revenge monologue or a moment of public shaming to feel whole again. The institutional validation from Judge Holloway was enough, but the real victory was the quiet of the house behind me. I stayed on the porch until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the yard where Ryan had planned to build his pool. The house felt solid, its walls holding the secrets of the past and the possibilities of a future where I no longer had to look over my shoulder. My relationship with my family was permanently altered, perhaps even broken beyond repair, but I was no longer the one carrying the burden of their expectations. I had protected the legacy, and in doing so, I had finally protected myself. As the first streetlights began to flicker on, I stood up and walked toward the front door, the keys heavy and cool in my hand. I realized then that they were right about one thing. The house finally belonged to the person who truly understood what it was worth. Some things in this life are bought with money, but the things that matter are kept with character.